Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Andy Salmon, the Asia editor at the Washington Times, about North Korean troops fighting alongside Russia against Ukraine and what the presidency of Donald Trump could mean for U.S. policy toward China and North Korea. Then we dive into disturbing new information about whether China could beat the United States in a war, whether the federal government is really going to try to break up Google, and if retired Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Mark Milley is positioning himself as a leading anti-Trump political figure. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor. Good show this week. We have Andy Salmon coming up from Seoul, South Korea. We get into a lot of the discussion about North Korean troops, aiding Russia in its war against Ukraine and what that means for the broader geopolitics and what it means for the Trump administration and its North Korea policy. But before we get to all of that, as always, Guy, first things first, what's on your radar this week?
Thanks, Ben. It is great to be here on the podcast for another week. Off the top, Ukrainian military officials have made headlines around the world by claiming that Russia fired an ICBM, or intercontinental ballistic missile, into Ukraine. Apparently, there was a volley of Russian strikes early Thursday that pounded the eastern Ukrainian city of Dnipro. With this claim swirling in the media as we prepared to tape this podcast on Thursday afternoon, November 21, U.S. sources were pushing back, saying it was not, in fact, an ICBM. Then Russian President Vladimir Putin put out a statement on Russian television saying that his forces had employed a new intermediate range ballistic missile, an IRBM, in this strike on Thursday morning. The IRBM typically has a range of about more than 1,800 miles. So why Russia would need this for an attack on neighboring Ukraine is perplexing at a minimum. Putin said in his statement that the launch was in response to Ukrainian strikes in recent days on Russian territory using U.S. and British supplied missiles. Earlier this week, it seems to be about sending a message just days after the Biden administration lifted longstanding restrictions on Ukraine's use of long-range American missiles that can hit much deeper inside Russian territory.
I mean, this raises the fear of escalation, right? That we've talked about a lot of times in this show. If you have North Korean troops joining the Russians, that's an escalation. The U.S. taking the gloves off and allowing Ukraine to use ATACMS and other weapons to fire deeper into Russia could be an escalation. The IRBM, could be an escalation. So it does kind of bring into sharper focus what the Biden administration's policy both has been toward Ukraine and will be for its final 2 months in office. And I wrote about this in the Washington Times this week, Guy, about the confusion around Biden's policy on the Russia-Ukraine war and how a lot of analysts believe that if the administration actually wanted Ukraine to win the war, you would have allowed ATACMS to be fired into Russia much sooner. You would have sent Abrams tanks, F-16 HIMARS, all that stuff much, much earlier in greater numbers if possible. And we didn't. And you ask yourself why we're doing it now, especially if you're going to get this kind of a backlash and potential escalation from Russia. There's two possible answers, I think, Guy. One answer could be that Biden and his team finally came around and decided this is just the right thing to do. A more cynical interpretation, and one that I probably agree with, is they want to box in the Trump administration politically and geopolitically. Democrats want to be able to say they did everything they could for Ukraine. They gave the Ukrainian military everything they needed. And it's that damn Donald Trump that's forcing Ukraine to essentially surrender and give up parts of its own country to Russia in a ceasefire deal. But look, those of us who have been following the war for the past almost 3 years will know better, of course. And I'm not sure Trump or his team really care about the optics of this. He's clearly wants to just end the war as quick as possible. What do you think's going on there, Guy? Is this political posturing by Biden and his team?
It's all very interesting what you're saying, Ben. Biden didn't actually announce the policy shift. So there's a kind of message misfiring going on here. The administration also didn't deny the policy shift. Ukraine, though, has started firing deeper into Russia, and Russia has now responded. What you have in this more than 1,000-day-old war at this point is an escalation in the final weeks before Trump's arrival in the White House. So we'll see how much more intense this escalation gets over the coming weeks. Before we go on here, Ben, I want to highlight another thing on my radar from recent days, and that's the claim by the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission, an outfit that operates under a mandate of the U.S. Congress. The commission said in a report to lawmakers in recent days that China's military power now poses an acute threat to the United States, and that Chinese forces could potentially defeat the U.S. military in a future regional conflict in Asia. Such a clash might erupt around the Chinese Communist Party government's stated desire to absorb the U.S.-backed island democracy of Taiwan. The U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission puts out regular reports on China based on both classified and unclassified intelligence. This latest report talks about how a large-scale military expansion by China over the past 20 years has given Beijing a formidable force of missiles, ships, aircraft, and other systems in preparation for the prospect of war in the Indo-Pacific. The report says, quote, U.S. forces and bases in the region would face a significant threat from the People's Liberation Army in any regional contingency involving treaty allies and or security partners, and the outcome of any such conflict is far from certain, end quote. That language, that the outcome is far from certain, is sobering, considering that the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission is notoriously calculated in its reports. We hear these kinds of things from hawks at the Pentagon or in the wider U.S. national security community from time to time, and they may be politicized to an extent. The U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission is not known as an organization that politicizes these things. That's why this kind of brazen claim caught my eye. And then finally, Ben, there's a little bit of advanced tech news on my radar. First, there's this federal court case making news in which Biden administration Justice Department officials and a bunch of regulators from several U.S. states are demanding a breakup of Google. I don't have much to say about it right now, other than that I don't know whether the U.S. government is going to force Google to sell Chrome or is going to force Google to break apart as a monopoly or not. But it's on my radar, and we'll be talking about it in the months ahead, especially because the incoming Trump administration is likely to have a totally different posture towards this and not support the calls for a Google breakup. So this is going to be playing out for a while. As you know, in the Threat Status newsletter, I have been tracking another high-tech issue over the past few months, and that's whether or not there should be a single large language AI model that gets used and shared by all U.S. intelligence agencies, from the NSA to the CIA to the NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and so on. Or should there be competing large language models? It's a sort of confusing and technical debate, and it's also pretty secretive, but I highlight it because it has to do with laying the foundations for what is now fast becoming the futuristic relationship between the U.S. government and artificial intelligence. There are tons of implications here. How U.S. intel ultimately uses AI could shape the future direction of the human species. But for now, what caught my eye in recent days were that several key companies are becoming deeply involved in all of this. It's been announced that the San Francisco-based company Anthropic is now collaborating with the emerging defense tech giant Palantir and with Amazon to bring what Anthropic calls its Claude AI models to the U.S. intelligence community. It's notable that both the U.S. and the United Kingdom's AI safety institutes announced in recent days that they had both conducted early testing of Anthropic's newest Claude AI model. What does that ultimately mean for how AI spreads through the U.S. intelligence community, how the CIA and other agencies use it? We'll be keeping track of that at Threat Status at the Washington Times, Ben.
Going back to this idea, China and the U.S. in a future conflict and how we would fare. I mean, it's an important question to consider because it is going to set the agenda and sort of the mood around, does the U.S. pull back? Do we try to avoid those conflicts? Some would call that get more isolationist, or do we prepare militarily for the hopefully the event that doesn't occur, that we do end up in one of those wars? So that's one of the big picture geopolitical foreign policy questions that the Trump administration, hopefully will get some answers to in the first months and years of the Trump administration. But General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a frequent target of Donald Trump, he waded into this debate a little bit the other night at a Palace Foundation event. And he said, quote, "I wouldn't say we're going to be isolationists. I wouldn't go that far, but there's a probability that there will be some sort of retraction over time. This isn't going to be instant, but over time of U.S. military forces overseas," unquote. He said a lot of other things, too, by the way, during this speech. He pushed back hard against the notion floated by Trump's defense secretary nominee, Fox host Pete Hegseth, that women shouldn't be in combat. Milley said, quote, "Don't lecture me about women in combat," unquote. And went on to say that if women are qualified for the job, then they should do it, even if that does, in fact, mean being on the front lines of a military confrontation. Milley also addressed the idea of the warrior board, which apparently some folks in the Trump orbit want to create an independent board that could review and possibly even remove active duty generals. Milley said nobody really knows what that means yet, and it should be fair, the Trump campaign, the Trump administration, incoming Trump administration itself hasn't put that formal proposal out yet. It's a lot of speculation and anonymous sources. But the big picture from all of this guy is, for me, it's no accident that Milley gave this speech. He didn't need to. This is someone who, let's be honest here, there's no love lost between Donald Trump and Mark Milley. I don't think anybody would argue that. And I was really curious just personally to see whether Milley, who I should say I know a little bit, I've met him and interviewed him and have a photo of the two of us together hanging in my office. I wondered whether he might retreat from the spotlight, as a lot of retired military folks do, from the political spotlight at least, or whether he would embrace a role as a possible Trump foil. I mean, is he going to be, in the John Brennan mold, if you will, going on CNN all the time, attacking Trump and whatever the controversy of the day that's ginned up by a lot of media outlets who are very anti-Trump in their coverage? This speech suggests to me that it's a possibility that he might actually be willing to do that as a retired chairman, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, take on that role. And it makes me wonder how many other retired officials in the worlds that we cover and are familiar with, whether it's folks from the Pentagon, the FBI, the intelligence community, even Congress to some degree. What's that going to look like? The Trump quote unquote resistance movement that we saw, during his first term, where you did have a lot of those folks who were more than willing to go on TV as much as they possibly could and say bad things about Donald Trump and his team. I wonder if that's going to be any different this time. Having the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as one of those folks would be certainly fascinating to watch. And it's something that I'm going to keep my eye on personally, because I think Milley's not somebody you would have expected to be in that role, I think, in sort of the pre-Trump era. I don't think folks would have pegged him as being one of those individuals, but we're in strange times now.
No, totally interesting questions, Ben. I don't put Milley in the same camp as former CIA Director John Brennan and former ODNI Director James Clapper, who both essentially became talking heads on cable television at the start of the first Trump administration, perpetuating basically the claim that Trump was a Russian agent. So I think he would learn from that. And as you pointed out, these comments were made not on television. They were made at an event. I think you'll see a lot of that. You might see high-level former officials like that doing that, but I'll be surprised if we see anything like we did back in 2017 at that level. Andrew Salmon is the Asia editor for the Washington Times. He's based in Seoul, South Korea. He's a pillar of Threat Status. His correspondence covering security and geopolitical issues from the region is featured almost daily in the Threat Status newsletter. Please find it and subscribe for free. Andy's one of the most seasoned journalists writing in English in Asia. He's been around. We're so lucky he's on our reporting team. Andy, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Guy, many thanks. Good to see you.
Let's jump right into this. Volodymyr Zelensky this week made headlines. It was kind of drowned out in Washington with all that's going on with Trump and his appointments. But he said that he basically warned that in the coming months, there could be as many as 100,000 North Korean troops on the Ukraine border supporting Russia. What did you make of that over there in Seoul, and how do you read that? Is that possible? Will the North Koreans do that?
Well, firstly, Kim controls one of the largest standing armies on earth. 100,000 men, sorry, would be, well short of 10% of his overall force. However, my understanding is that that figure, which has also been mentioned by people here, would be troops rotating through into and out of existing units which are deployed to Russia. So it seems unlikely that he'd have a force of 100,000 men, which would be what, give or take, 8, 9, maybe 10 divisions of troops. However, if, as is believed, that one of the aims of Kim with this operation is to give his men as much up-to-date millennial combat experience in the new war as possible, that then it's feasible. That also, of course, assumes that there's going to be hostilities continuing into the long term, rather than that. There's also a belief here that quite possibly Putin is making very serious moves on Kursk Oblast in order to eject this Ukrainian lodgement ahead of anticipated talks when Trump enters office.
The Kursk dynamics are certainly interesting. They could give Ukraine chances elsewhere on the Eastern Front, depending how things happen. And we could speculate about that. But with regard to Kim Jong Un and the Kim regime and its relationship, this military alliance that's kind of come to the fore now between Russia and North Korea, what is Kim Jong Un hoping to get in exchange from Russia? You've written about this a little bit. Advanced military equipment, is there any actual truth to that? What do you see? You've been in the region for so long. You've written books on North Korea. I mean, what are the North Koreans trying to get here?
Well, I think there's a great deal they can get. Bear in mind that for decades, a couple of decades, or most certainly since 2016, when a very heavy sanctions regime was enacted against North Korea. North Korea has been seen as a rogue state. Its persona non grata in global society. Its trade and interaction opportunities are very limited. Suddenly, it's been joined in this kind of status by Russia after Putin invaded Ukraine proper in 2022. So, in that sense, they've suddenly found themselves with a new brother nation in this status, and that opens all kinds of opportunities for him. Firstly, economically, these two economies are very complementary. On the one hand, Russia can supply vast amounts of grain, and fuel, oil rather than gas. North Korea doesn't use gas. And those are two things that Kim always needs: food and energy. In addition, he wants advanced weaponry, ISR capabilities. So I think we're looking at military satellite technology, ICBM warhead reentry vehicle technology, maybe nuclear submarine technology, this kind of pretty high-end stuff, which again, the Russians are able to supply. They won't necessarily give him finished products, but they may well supply him with blueprints.
What about the China piece of this? I mean, until now, China has sort of is tacitly supporting Russia and it's buying Russian energy that's not going to Europe, right? It's tacitly supporting Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. But how does China, what are you seeing in the region with regard to the Chinese Communist Party's sort of response and posture towards this, what is really a historic North Korean troop movement?
Yeah, I mean, this is the largest deployment of East Asian troops to Europe since, I don't know, since Genghis Khan. So this is really changing the global security dynamics. For years now, we've talked about this growing competition between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, these continental powers in the center of the Eurasian continent, being countered by the democracies on the eastern and western edges of it. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO in the west, and then this sort of loose, it's not even an alliance, but a coalition perhaps of democracies on the east. Yeah, NATO and has been talking a great deal about sort of building links with Japan and South Korea and Australia, out here in the Asian sphere. But this has mainly been talking rather than doing, and some, clearly we're all interoperable. We all used US standard NATO weaponry and so forth. But what Putin and Kim are doing now is far more significant. These guys are actually fighting side by side. So this is very, very a significant shift. And I think the Russians and North Koreans have really seized the initiative in this situation, that the world's pretty shocked. China's stance is difficult to clarify. Personally, I'm not involved in meetings of the CCP. Those are held behind closed doors. It is not a very transparent regime. There are two schools of thought on where Xi stands on this. One is that Xi is not a warrior president. China is not a warrior nation. It last pulled a trigger, fired a bullet in 1988 against Vietnam in the Spratly Islands. Since then, the PLA has been massively expanding, has great new capabilities, but is very risk averse. There's a strong belief here that China is not keen to get engaged in shooting wars. On the other hand, if you do divide the world into two spheres of influence, the CRINC or the authoritarian continental states versus the sort of the peripheral maritime democratic states, then it fits Xi's worldview that other countries, arguably you could both call them both Chinese proxies, economic proxies perhaps, are confronting the West and consuming, Western time, energy, and resources. All this having been said, let us continue to remind ourselves that China is a competitor of the United States. It's not actually an enemy. And we've got enormous leverage over China, which we don't have with either North Korea or Russia, both of which are massively sanctioned and which are unable to really trade with the West. So the Chinese economy is massively exposed to the global economy. So Xi is very, very restricted in his freedom of action.
Well, Andy, so you mentioned interoperability. When you talk to folks in the Pentagon and sort of what's the connective tissue between the Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, they will say that none of those countries have anywhere close to the interoperability that we do, for example, with South Korea, with NATO allies, where we can relatively seamlessly incorporate our arms, our weapons, and certainly our personnel, even our doctrines to an extent, and can function as one if needed. They don't, the other side, the axis of authoritarians, whatever you want to call it, they don't have that. But are Russia and North Korea gaining that right now as we speak? Are they able, best as we can tell, to function together on the front lines of the Russia-Ukraine war? Or are these still two very separate and distinct militaries that as of today are not interoperable in any significant way?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the huge questions hanging over us. Again, we've according to Ukrainian sources, there have been some skirmishes with the North Koreans, but we haven't seen the deployment of their main massive maneuver as yet. So the big Kursk offensive, I think, hasn't started yet. Putin is still massing Russian forces and hasn't unleashed this very cohesive North Korean force. So can they work together? The Americans work at this all over the world, and they're getting pretty good at this. But even so, and even going back to World War II, the Americans and the British, who speak the same language, I mean, pretty much, had issues with interoperability. How the North Koreans are going to handle this, I don't know. What I would say is that in many ways, the KPA, the Korean People's Army, is a copy of the old Soviet Red Army in miniature. So I think the Russians will kind of recognize what they're seeing. Secondly, they use pretty much the same weaponry. North Korea's innovated quite a lot of stuff, but nevertheless, they're using Warsaw Pact style weaponry and munition. In terms of tactics, our understanding from watching the Ukraine war is Russian tactics have changed massively. What we're seeing in Ukraine, rather than the old mass maneuver strategy of the Soviets, that no longer works in the Ukraine battle space, which is just incredibly lethal. What we're seeing and what the Russians have been doing for the last 2 years, when they advance, they're sending forward their cannon fodder to basically get wiped out, but to identify the Ukrainian heavy weapons positions. Those positions are then taken out by long-range fires, drone and air, and then they exploit forward with their sort of their crack light infantry. Again, the Vedev, the Marines, some Spetsnaz brigades, and some of the better of the PMCs, the private military companies. These are the assault troops. Once those assault troops have then taken ground, again the masses move forward. The line is sort of held, fortified, and then the process is repeated, and the advance grinds forward. So we think that the North Koreans are probably being trained in this format of warfare. But of course, this is also dial-up. This is network-centric warfare. The Ukrainians have been very, very, very good at this because prior to the war, the Ukrainians were sort of like the India of Europe. This is where you outsourced all your technology, all your software to. So the Ukrainians have become very, very, very good at network-centric stuff. They've innovated Android apps for calling in artillery fire. They've innovated these very, very effective quadricopter drones, these little commercial drones, and they're hanging clusters of Zog rifle grenades from them, and then using these as direct drop weapons into Russian foxholes and vehicle hatches. That's how accurate they are. So the Ukrainians got very, very good at this very, very fast. We don't know how well the North Koreans are going to be able to innovate in this way, particularly as we don't believe that North Koreans, for example, are allowed to use. I mean, North Koreans do have smartphones within their civilian economy, operating off the North Korean intranet rather than the World Wide Web, but we don't know how well those apps are able to sync with, satellite links, artillery, and so on. So there's a lot of unknowns hanging over how well they're going to interoperate. And of course, there's the language barrier, which is a significant barrier, especially with signals communications.
Kinetics are so much about reality, but let's get back to theoretics and geopolitics for a second. Some want President-elect Trump to come in and sort of move quickly towards a wedge strategy vis-a-vis Russia, North Korea. Can you help us understand that? I mean, based on China and how China is behaving, the Chinese Communist Party's history with the Kim regime, could it be possible for the U.S. to drive a wedge between China and North Korea, China and Russia? We had Dan Hoffman, the former Russia station chief for the CIA, who writes a biweekly column for Threat Status. He had a piece questioning this a couple days ago. Our listeners can easily find it by Googling Dan Hoffman Threat Status or Dan Hoffman Washington Times. What do you think about this wedge strategy idea in Trump?
It is something that's being talked about here. Again, we don't fully get what the CCP thinks about this war. On the one hand, does Xi think Putin has gone too far? He's caused instability around the world. He's just raised the stakes overall. This is high risk. Xi doesn't like it. Or do we take the point of view that actually for Xi, this all works towards his grand scheme? And of course, no Chinese forces are engaged, so it makes sense for this war to continue. Of course, in the long term, if Russia is weakened and North Korea is already economically basically a black hole, these countries become more and more dependent upon him, and he takes de facto control of the crink or the axis of authoritarianism. We don't really know his thinking on this. This is not expressed, but I think it's definitely worth trying, particularly with Trump coming into the White House, new ideas, innovative ideas, arguably, creative and unpredictable ideas. Why not try to drive this wedge between China, which is, as we said, part of the global economy, and North Korea, which is just this rather bizarre state that is just way out there in left field. But I do think that perhaps Xi has been surprised, as we all have, by how swiftly this new Russia-North Korea comprehensive strategic partnership is taking off.
Biden's team, I don't know about Joe Biden and his sort of elderly state at this point, but his team certainly understood that as he went to Peru and had a meeting with Xi Jinping in the last couple of days, because the White House statement, which was really otherwise conciliatory towards Xi, the White House statement on the Xi Biden meeting in Peru at the Group of 20 leaders meeting, it clearly pointed out that Biden brought up the North Korean troops to Xi Jinping. What else got said there, or hand movements or whatever they got into, it's like you said, being a fly on the wall in a CCP meeting, being a fly on the wall of a Biden Xi meeting. I don't know. I think it's going to be very different with Trump.
I think it may well be, but I also think we perhaps shouldn't overestimate the leverage that China has over North Korea. North Korea very, very much is its own man. It does its own thing. It's clearly decided to move much, much, much closer to Russia. And of course, Russia can provide pretty much everything that Chinese can provide. So Kim is the one who may be driving the wedge between Beijing and Moscow.
Andy Salmon, Washington Times Asia Bureau Chief, regular threat status contributor. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Gents, thank you.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here on the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is affecting U.S. national security right now this week as you all are listening to the show. Guy, what's your threat of the week?
My threat of the week, Ben, is that with or without government regulations or interventions, humans are accelerating toward a world in which artificial intelligence takes control of the earth. I know it sounds like science fiction, but here's the deal. It's one of the main points of a newly released book called Genesis that was co-authored by leading technologists Eric Schmidt and Craig Mundy. And get this, the late Henry Kissinger, who died last year at the age of 100. The rise of AI capability to create, quote, superhuman, end quote, people is a major topic of concern for the authors of Genesis, who warn that AI tools have already started outpacing human capabilities, and people may need to consider biologically engineering themselves to ensure they're not rendered inferior or wiped out by advanced machines. Maybe it sounds crazy, but depending on who you talk to in the U.S. intelligence community, Ben, this race of biotechnology is already well underway, and it's somewhere near the core of great power competition between the U.S. and China as well.
Biotechnology and AI, I'm going to go with something a little more elemental, which is bad food or a lack of food for troops in both the United States and otherwise is my threat of the week. Iran Corporation study from last year found that more than 25% of active duty military service members said they're food insecure, which means they're either skipping meals or not getting enough to eat. Now, the Pentagon has launched major initiatives to try and increase troops' access to food, particularly healthy food, because you don't want troops just eating cheap fast food or trans fats or a bunch of junk all the time, right? Healthy eating makes for healthier fighters, and that makes for a better military. So things, the Defense Department knows that. They've launched a number of initiatives to try to address the problem, but It's not enough. A GAO report from just a couple months ago in June found the Defense Department, quote, has not fully addressed congressionally directed efforts to increase access to nutritious food. Specifically, one of the issues on bases is there's supposed to be color-coded nutrition labels identifying good foods that troops should eat often and red ones that they should avoid. That wasn't being done. The U.S. isn't alone here. Our allies have major problems with this as well. A major story by NGL Media last month found serious problems with the quality of food the Ukrainian government is giving to its forces on the front lines of its war with Russia. In Britain, military officials earlier this year announced major changes to bring wider varieties and higher qualities of food to their troops as well. So this issue isn't flying under the radar anymore for the most part, but it's still a threat right now because, well, food's important. And right now, too many troops, both the U.S. and our allies, they're either not getting enough of it or the quality of what they're getting is just too low. And that's why it's my threat of the week.
Once again, Ben.
Food guy, something we both love.
Thanks for that.
Of course. And thank you all for listening. Please do go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends. And a big thank you, of course, to Andy Salmon for coming on the show this week. Guy and I will be back with you next week on the Threat Status Podcast.